In this lesson, we will focus on the security interceptor component within the Spring Security Framework. The security interceptor is responsible for granting access to different resources within our application. There are two varieties of security interceptors which are meant to protect different secured resources. The first is a filter security interceptor. This interceptor basically filters all requests coming in, inspects their URL, and then decides whether or not to grant access to that particular resource. The method security interceptor inspects all method invocations within our execution and decides whether or not a particular principal can invoke a method. Now, all of these security interceptors are configured using config attributes. So these are simple pieces of configuration that we provide, maybe via XML or via an annotation, to the security interceptor implementation, and it uses that information to determine who should be granted access to what resources, so methods or different HTTP resources that we're serving up through the application. So these are the two primary security interceptors that you will deal with within Spring Security. You can make your own implementation of the security interceptor by extending the abstract security interceptor class. However, most of the situations you will encounter have already been handled by these two security interceptors. So let's talk about how these security interceptors find their way into our applications, which are secured by Spring Security. If you look at the top left box, there we see a snippet from our web.xml file. And we are putting in place a delegating filter proxy, and we are naming that filter Spring Security Filter Chain. If you'll remember, within our security configuration files, securitycontext.xml, we then use the HTTP tag in order to quickly configure our application. Now, there's another tag within that security namespace, the global method security tag, and that would enable a method security interceptor. But looking closely at the HTTP tag, we don't really see an interceptor being set up there. So if we look at our lower box, we really see what's going on behind the scenes with that HTTP tag. So what happens is that a filter chain proxy is created, and it will have an ID of Spring Security Filter Chain, and that bean establishes the chain of filters that will be consulted when we access resources through the application. So when a request comes in, all of these filters are going to be checked against that URL, and we're going to decide if a particular principal has permissions to access that resource. Now, you'll see that within that filter chain, we have a filter security interceptor filter that we're pointing to, and that's defined as a bean lower within our configuration. In a nutshell, the delegating filter proxy points to a filter chain which can have many filters. Within that chain, a filter security interceptor is placed when we use the HTTP configuration tag. So we went through and used this, but we didn't talk really about the underlying details of how that configuration works. So once the filter security interceptor and the method security interceptor are in place, what happens? Well, they're going to sit and intercept every request coming in. Basically, every request will get routed to them. And for the filter security interceptor, it's really going to be protecting all the requests coming into our different controller methods. So there we see that we have our filter security interceptor, which we see in green, and we're highlighting the request mappings, which are really going to be where particular URLs will be routed within our application in our controllers. Next, you'll see in red the method security interceptor, and it's looking at that secured annotation, and that's a configuration attribute for the method security interceptor. And when it sees that secured annotation, it's going to require some sort of authorization to execute or invoke that method. We've been talking a lot mainly about access control. So, how does this have to deal with authentication? Here is where the tie in to authentication occurs. When that principal, so our user, submits a request that's going to access some resource, whether it be a method or some HTTP resource, the security interceptor stands in place. And the first question it really asks is this user authenticated? If the user is authenticated, we check their access, and based upon our authorization rules, we will grant them access or not. But if the principal has not been authenticated, then we're going to drop down into this large green bar here. Within that green bar, we see all of the components that are really important for authentication within Spring Security. So we're going to be taking a look at these individual pieces. We're going to learn how to customize them. So we're peeling back the layers of the onion, kind of getting past some of the superficial points of Spring Security, and really looking at what's underneath the hood and what we can customize to fit our application. So here you'll see within that authentication umbrella that we see in the lower green bar, we're going to be working with an authentication object, and that is going to be containing the user's credentials as well as storing more information about the user once we have authenticated them. The authentication object will get passed to an authentication manager that is going to delegate to an authentication provider. And here is where our real authentication takes place. The authentication provider is going to make that determination that this user is who they say they are. Now, some authentication providers will work with a user detail service, and this is basically reaching into some sort of data store, whether it be in memory, a database, an LDAP, and it pulls out information about the user. Some of that information contains their credentials that we're going to then validate with what has been provided by the user. So it depends upon the type of authentication provider whether or not we will use that user detail service. Finally, once we have authenticated a user, we're going to place that authentication object or that user within the security context holder. And this is a component that is available to us throughout our controllers that allows us to retrieve security information about the principal. We're looking at security interceptors right now from the perspective that they allow us to tie into the authentication process within Spring Security. And now we're going to begin to focus on those components that make up the authentication process.